Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. Martin Sambrook. He's joining us from England. I'm really excited about that. He's the author of the book Lions in the Jungle, which is about the Chindits and Brigadier Wingate operating in Burma against the Japanese during World War II. That's a really exciting topic. They operated with American glider forces during World War II. The original Air Commandos operated in support of them, and it's an aspect of airborne operation that I'm really eager to pursue conversation about. So, Martin, thank you for joining us tonight.
Absolute pleasure.
So the coolest thing about having you on as a guest, Martin, is this is an opportunity to talk to somebody who's had a chance to interview folks who participated in relatively lesser known operations in World War II. People who are real fans of airborne, kind of focus on the ETO, Sicily, Italy, definitely Normandy and Market Garden. If they're really hardcore, they talk about operations in the Pacific, like the 11th Airborne Division, but nobody really focuses on Burma. So how did you get involved in researching this aspect of World War II?
Okay, in a kind of roundabout way. I met some veterans in a restaurant in my hometown, and they were, gosh, this was about 10 years ago now, so they would have been in their mid-80s, I guess, and they were absolutely splendidly turned out in their suits, ties, regimental ties, and medals, and they were just out for a lunch, and I got chatting with these guys, and I said, where did you serve? And they said, we were Chindits. And to my shame, I didn't know what a Chindit was. It was kind of somewhere in my mind, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. It was a really interesting conversation I had with these guys, and it got me reading more about the Burma campaign and the war in the Far East. And then over a period of time, given the amount of military history I was reading, I decided to take a master's course in military history, and it was a master's, a research master's. So you have to find a historical question to research, and I was originally going to do a research project on Sherman and the March to the Sea, being interested in American military history as well, but because of some research challenges, on the other side of the pond or whatever, being based here in the UK, I decided to go for the Chindits, where I had more ready access to the research files, which is kind of odd in a way, because I ended up spending a lot of time in the digital archives of the US, because that's where the research took me. It was kind of interesting. But that's a bit of a roundabout answer, but that's kind of the background to it. And then during the latter stages of the research, I got involved with a group called the Chindits Society, which is the successor organisation to what was known as the Burma Star organisation, and they were formed for the veterans of the Far East, Britain's forgotten army, as they were termed, the Chindits Society were a subgroup of this, and that is still in force as a charitable organisation for the Chindits who are surviving, the veterans who survived, and also for the families of former Chindits. And a couple of times a year they get together for dinners and for engagements, and veterans and their families come together. And it's fantastic to see these guys in their 90s, some of them over 100, still turning up for the Chindit events, and getting to chat with some of them. Unbelievable. And we've just had VJ Day, of course, just a couple of weeks ago, for the end of the war in Burma. And the Chindits were well represented at the celebrations that were taking place, or the commemoration, I should say, not celebration.
Certainly. Well, that's a very amazing story. It's always a treat to get to talk to the veterans of World War II. They tend to be as sharp as you imagine they'd been 75 years ago. That's for sure.
Yeah.
For my listeners who may not be familiar with operations in Burma, can you tell them a little bit about why the Chindits were organized, what their mission was, what the how they became an air mobile force, if you will, and if you could also tie in the American connection with the Air Commandos.
Yeah. So this might ramble on for a little while, so bear with me. The origin of the Chindits is very much the brainchild of the commander of the Chindits, General Ord Wingate, or Major Ord Wingate as he was at the time. He found some favour and disfavour, I have to say. He was very much an anti-establishment figure, and that resonates throughout the history of Wingate and the Chindits, and has resonated through to this day. But he made a name for himself in the Middle East in the early stages of the Second World War, and indeed before. He was working with the British Army in Palestine, as it was at the time, to counter the Arab insurgency, and he helped to organise the Jewish fighters, the Jewish brigades who fought to arm the kibbutzes and arm the towns against the incursions from the Arabs, because the British also needs to protect the oil pipelines, the usual economic interest in these things. But he became very attached to the Jewish cause, and became somewhat of a champion of Jewish rights, which wasn't quite the right thing to do when the British were there trying to hold the balance between the Jewish interest and the Palestinian interest. And because he became such an advocate, it was seen best that he was sort of bundled out of Palestine to try and settle things down a little bit, much to his disgust. He then found fame fighting against the Italians in the early stages of the Second World War, and he organised what he was to call long-range penetration. And the idea was that you send lightly armed columns of troops deep behind enemy lines to disrupt their lines of communication. And he evolved these ideas, and his ultimate commanding officer in that campaign was General Wavell, who became the supreme commander in the Far East at the time of the Japanese invasion. And Wavell had seen the success that Wingate had in wresting Eritrea back from the Italians, and in that campaign he famously rode into the capital in Eritrea with Haile Selassie, the emperor, in tow with him to put him back on the throne. So you can see it's quite a colourful character, this Wingate guy. But he gets called by and by, again, some ups and downs in terms of disgrace with the establishment, but he gets called by Wavell anyway back to active service during the Japanese invasion in 1942. And he was given the brief to try and do something about challenging the Japanese comfort in the jungle, because the British were a very road-bound military organisation, and this is where the air power becomes important later. But the British mentality was very road-bound. You know, supplies were by road, everything moved by road, line of communications by road. So the Japanese tactics of short hucks through the jungle, they cut off the British on their road-bound tactics, and panic would ensue, and defeat after defeat for the British in their engagements, and it famously became the longest retreat in British military history across the length of Burma over several months, and the remnants of the British army straggled out of Burma into northeast India, starving, bedraggled, and short of all of their weapons and armour. Massive humiliation. And Wingate was observing all of this and trying to understand the tactics that could be used to counter this advantage that the Japanese had. And he took this idea of long-range penetration as a philosophy of how you can fight in the jungle against the Japanese and beat them at their own game. bit of a rambling answer, but that's where we are. And then from there, he was given a mission by Wavell for the first Chindit operation in February of 1943, which was supposed to be part of a wider British advance. But the story of Burma was that the British cancelled advance after advance. All plans got canned, primarily because of the lack of resources, because of the Germany First strategy. The army in Burma, in India, wasn't the forgotten army because they didn't have the material to fight against the Japanese. They had a million men under arms, if not more, but they didn't really have the material to wage warfare in any meaningful way. The Navy was preoccupied in Europe and the Atlantic. The US Navy was preoccupied with the Pacific campaign. So there weren't really resources there. So again, cut a long story short, what was termed Operation Longcloth took place in February to April of 1943, where the Chindits alone, about 3,000 of them, marched in to Burma in about 6 columns of men, of about 500 men each, and their transport were donkeys or mules, I should say, and everything was by pack animal, and they went into these columns on different routes through the jungle, advanced into Burma, about 150, 200 miles behind Japanese lines, caused a little bit of chaos, and then once the Japanese realised what was going on, they retreated, but not before they'd suffered quite heavy losses due to disease, malnutrition, and trying to supply them was difficult because that hadn't yet been perfected as an art, that the supply drop in the jungle. But it was a very important stepping stone in the British learning how to fight in the jungle. So that's that's the story of how it started, and that takes us up to, I guess, the real meat of the Chindit story, which is how the Americans get involved and how they make the Chindits an air mobile organization.
Exactly. So this is a great place to bring it up now. So how did the Phil Cochran and Colonel Allison and the Air Commandos get married up with General Wingate and his Chindits?
Yeah. So what we have to do is sort of step back from what's happening in Burma and look at a bit of the grand strategy that's going on with Churchill and Roosevelt and the chiefs of staff. The Americans are getting pretty ticked off with the British at the Casablanca conference about what they saw as the British reluctance to either advance quickly across the Channel to fight the Germans, or indeed to engage with the Japanese in Burma. So coming out of the Casablanca conference in January of 43, the Americans would try to pin it on the British to actually make some commitments. And buried in the records of the Casablanca conference, you find reference to the Chindit operation, where the British try to say, look, we're doing something, there is an advance going on. And then this theme recurs at the Trident conference in Washington in I think it was in May of 43, and then again General Marshall and the chiefs of staff are really getting exasperated at the British reluctance to engage with the Japanese and actually commit to doing something this side of Christmas 43. And things come to a head at the next conference, which is at Quebec in the August of 43. And Churchill is really on the hook to try and do something now for Roosevelt and the American chiefs of staff. And this episode where Wingate goes into the jungle with his troops in the February to April is a real tonic for British spirits. After a litany of defeats and retreats, The press make the most of the story about how the British have taken the Japanese on at their own game in the jungle, and really pumped up the reputation of the British troops, because it certainly needed something. And Churchill dramatically gets Wingate to fly back from Burma to London for a briefing to debrief the British chiefs of staff, and at that briefing he has a dinner with Wingate, and he quickly decides he's going to take Wingate with him to the Quebec Conference. This is a guy in the hierarchy of the British Army who's pretty low down, and yet Churchill decides to take him with him. And this is one of the things where the historical writings about Chindits and the British military establishment try to castigate the whole Chindit episode as a folly of Churchill's and the ego of Wingate. But what you have to realise is that Wingate was invited because of the need for Churchill to get agreements at the strategic level with the Americans, not just in Burma, but in the sanctity of the Germany First strategy, and the whole hierarchy of what operations are going to happen where and when in 1944. The Chindits and Wingate become a bargaining chip in this for Churchill, where he can demonstrate to the American chiefs of staff that the British are going to be active in Burma. And interestingly, Marshall, and specifically Arnold, General Arnold, chief of the army, say, okay, we'll back you, because they hear the plans and they've heard the stories of how difficult it is to march through the jungles in Burma, because you've got these rivers a mile wide, you've got Razorback Hills 3,000 feet high, all covered in jungle, and in the monsoon conditions as well. How do you fight in that terrain? And Arnold said, we'll make you air mobile. And uniquely, I think, in World War II, what General Arnold does, he summons both Allison and Cochrane for an interview, and they end up being joint commanders of this combined air wing. And as far as I've read it, it's a unique thing in aviation history in World War II, where you've got this air wing that's a combination of fighter bombers, fighters, transports, and of course gliders, and prototype helicopters.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and you can imagine the jealousy, the envy of the British military establishment in India, starved of resources, and Wingate comes back from the Quebec Conference like a kid who's just got Christmas presents. And obviously it upset a lot of the establishment, because Wingate doesn't play the establishment game. He rubs everyone up the wrong way. He's quite rude to those in authority, as long as he gets his way. And he's come back to Burma with a unique proposition of the first Air Commando, and that forms these ideas for the next invasion of Burma by the Chindits in March 44, because his planning was always going to be that they'd march in again. And Cochrane says, "What do you mean march in? We'll fly you in." And then you've got these British soldiers who suddenly become airborne troops, and they start training in gliders with the first Air Commando. And I think one of the fabulous things about when you read the history of it and the interviews with the British troops is the real bond they had with the Air Commando in this period. They were really tight. And one of the things I say in the book, in trying to assess the the efficacy of the Chindits and the successes of the Chindits and the contribution of the Chindits to the victory in Burma is you have to think of the operation as a twinned operation. You can't have the Chindits without the Air Commando. You know, you have to see it as a combined force. That's what made it effective. And you know, it gave the Chindits mobility. It gave them air power with our air artillery, with you know, with dive bombers and rocket launched ordnance. So that, you know, the Chindits would radio from the ground the guys into a target, you know, in very close proximity. And one of the things that Wingate developed was he'd have an RAF officer with each Chindit column who could tell the air where to land the supplies, what's the best place to put supplies down, and B, what's the best approach to attack a target. So you had an RAF officer in conjunction with the ground troops marching with them, who could guide in the air part of the force. So that's kind of sort of where we get to pre the March operation.
And it's an amazing composite, as you were saying. One thing that I find really interesting as well is I can only imagine the moral effect, not only of knowing that you have aerial resupply coming and you have fire support coming, but medical evacuation must have been considered very highly among these folks. Whereas before, in the long cloth operation, if you got wounded, you were being left behind because they couldn't pack you out.
That's right. And with the Air Commando, what I didn't say was they also had this light plane force that came along with it as well. So they had 4 wings of light planes, L1s and L5s, I think they were. And they were split into 4 groups. I think Stilwell, who had the Chinese and American force in the north of Burma, who was the American general, of course, with a long history in China and Burma operations. He had one flight of that, and the others were allocated to British forces, and a couple of those were allocated to the Chindits specifically. And as you say, you get injured, you would be flown out the same day. You get medevac by air to get treatment, and you know, as you say, the morale raising aspect of that is fabulous.
Now, when I was reading your book, one thing that I found fascinating was this idea that Wingate is the guy with the composite force now, and so he's pioneering new techniques, but he wasn't really given credit for those techniques by the establishment. And so what was if you could explain the source of that jealousy? Maybe he was getting all the press and he was a relatively minor guy and nobody really cared for his attitude. Because I know that General Slim in the official records and then in his book, Defeat into Victory, you know, it indicated, yes, they, you know, were of some minor tactical value. They did some interesting things with aircraft, but we were learning those lessons anyway. And I'm thinking, well, how are you learning those lessons if the only guy who had that kind of air support was Wingate? So I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, it's a valid question. I think the historical challenge, I think, is twofold. You know, we know that history is written by the victor, but it's also written by the survivor. And Wingate wasn't around because he died during the second operation quite early on in a plane crash with an American crew. And incidentally, he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery with that American air crew. But the remains ended up in Arlington National Cemetery. So Wingate is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
That is fascinating. That's a detail that I have missed. That's really interesting.
So you know, because Wingate wasn't there to defend the story of the Chindits, and also the Chindits were disbanded in February '45. So they weren't there to take part in the final push on Rangoon and the liberation of Burma. It was relatively easy, I think, for the establishment to minimise their contribution. And also Slim, up until the victories at Kohima when they were defending India against the Japanese in March of '44, simultaneous with the Chindit invasion of Burma, I should add. You know, his reputation in London wasn't great. Churchill never rated him particularly. You know, he wasn't, you know, one of Churchill's favourite generals by any means, and his reputation was created in the subsequent advance across Burma by the British. But you know, Slim did do, you know, a fantastic job retraining the British for jungle fighting at the same time that Wingate was operating. You know, but I think it was just Wingate's death that stopped him claiming the credit, and it was relegated by Slim, who became the colossus of the Burma campaign, and to some extent aided and abetted by Mountbatten, who was the supreme commander of Southeast Asia Command, to whom they both served. You know, a lot of the narrative of the reconquest of Burma was one that became Mountbatten's story of how brilliant he was, and Slim of how brilliant he was, and someone's reputation had to suffer. And I think there's evidence that Slim really chafed under what he thought the unequal fame that Wingate had relative to the force that he commanded. But as I point out in the book, you know, if you actually look at what the Chindits contributed at the tactical level in the engagements they were in that March, certainly in that March to August campaign, partly with Stilwell under American command at that point for the last few months of that campaign. At the tactical and the strategic for the destruction of the Japanese supplies that were trying to get through to Kohima, where the British were defending the Indian border, very much dismissed by Slim in Defeated to Victory. But if you look at the Japanese records, the Japanese debriefs that were done, I think mainly by American interviewers after the war, you know, they very much give credit to Wingate as transforming the way the British were perceived and destabilising the Japanese strategy for the defence of Burma. And I think it just comes down to, it comes down to, you know, sadly Wingate died in March '44, and he wasn't there to press home the stake and stake the claim for what the Chindits achieved. And over the last 70 years, you know, we've seen the Chindits trying to get some sort of credit back for what they achieved, and to some extent they did get recognition. But as I point out in the book, if you read any modern history of the Second World War, certainly of the Burma campaign, the narrative by very famous authors, you know, I sort of certainly don't count myself as a famous author, you know, I'm just an enthusiast. But, you know, all of these, you know, famous military historians, they defer to the establishment record. They, you know, they don't do any additional research. They don't look into the archives. They just take the official British history that was set up by the Cabinet Office in the 1950s by a guy called Kirby, who served in Burma under Slim, who had a real problem with Wingate, and Wingate didn't think much of him, and they clashed quite a lot. And Kirby clearly took his revenge. And a lot of the pro-Chindit historians and veterans as well thought Kirby was the one behind this revisionist history. But if you actually dig into the records of the interviews that took place by Kirby, it's the interviews with Slim that set the narrative.
Very interesting.
For me, you know, I'm not trying to denigrate what Slim achieved, because, you know, it was a fantastic achievement in terms of what you know, a relatively badly equipped British Army achieved in Burma in appalling conditions. But the denigration of Wingate and the Chindits achievement, as I say in the book, it's really down to Slim.
I think your book goes a very long way to restoring the balance in that narrative, sir.
Yeah, I hope so.
So one question for you, and I know that historians don't like to deal in counterfactuals, but I would be interested in hearing what you think. If had Wingate survived, what do you think his next steps would have been?
Yeah, well, there's a strong strand of thought there that he would have gone to Israel in the early days of the Israeli state, and would have served in a military capacity at a very high level. He was very close to the political leadership emerging in Israel at that time.
So did he retain correspondence and connections with them even while he was operating in Burma?
His family certainly did. His wife was still in contact with political leaders in Israel. I think it would have been a dangerous game for him to play to have done anything that was overtly visible, given that he sort of had his card marked during his time in Palestine by the British Army. And to be fair, he had his hands pretty full.
Certainly. Do you think he would have gone so far as to have resigned and been fully embraced to the emerging Israeli state and become a military leader for the Israeli Defense Force, or do you think he would have tried to get back there as part of the British military establishment?
The thinking is that he had plans to resign.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Or to retire from the British Army and go to Israel, because he became a committed Zionist from his time in Palestine.
Just a very, very interesting character from his
very
days through his death. Well, I really appreciate your time, sir. This has been a fantastic discussion. The information you share with the audience is great. The book, again, guys, is called Lions in the Jungle by Mr. Martin Sambrook. You can get it on Amazon. I got my copy via Kindle. It's a fantastic read. It takes you all the way from the halls of power down to operating in the jungle within the combined force of the Chindits and the 1st Air Commando. As an effective combined force as the Devil's Brigade with the Americans and the Canadians, as you have the Chindits and the 1st Air Commandos with the British and the Americans, but far less press. So Mr. Sambrook's gone to great lengths to correct that fact, and I hope you all enjoyed the book. So Mr. Sambrook, once again, thank you for joining us.
Cheers, Ben. Take care.
Good night, sir.